story that must be told. Here's a little story that must be told. Here's a little story. Here's a little story.
Fever 1.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about that too. I think.
Go by the name of Bboy Fever 1 from Seattle, Washington. I was born and raised out here. I started breaking in 1982, and a lot of us guys on the West Coast, we were up on popping and locking and the funk styles that was being created in the 70s. You know, I was really young. I was maybe 11 years old when I first witnessed popping and popping battles. And it was usually the older guys, you know, in their later teens, 17, 18. They looked like grown men to me at the time. A lot of them were gangbanging, you know. There was a lot of gang activity at the time when I first was exposed to, like, popping. And thus, most of the cats who were popping were, like, kind of like gangsters. You'd be at a party or you'd be downtown Seattle Center hanging out, and you would see like a battle break out, and it'd usually be some pretty thugged out looking individuals like in each other's face, just like hitting, smoking weed, and, you know, talking shit. And so I wouldn't even dare step into a cypher trying to pop because I was no good at it. And back then, if you tried to front or try to come into a circle, you would just get chastised. So for me, I was just more of like an outsider looking in. Shortly after, I started seeing breaking, and they were combining not just breaking, but they were bringing the whole culture to you, you know, with graffiti and emceeing and DJing and the breaking. It was already handed to us like a package already set. When I saw hip-hop and saw people breaking and getting down on the ground, that was more like my pace, because I was always into martial arts films growing up and huge Bruce Lee fan. When I saw heads doing footwork on the ground and doing more of the like physical style of dance, I knew that was something that I could do. So for me, I had like two basic moves. It was like a suicide and a head spin. It was like two what they would consider like power moves back then. Suicide is where you do a front flip, but you land on your back. So you kind of like control yourself with the break and fall of your arms and your feet landing on the ground, but it looks like you're landing flat on your back. And then the other one was like a one-shot head spin. I just get on my head and do a head spin. But really later on, what made you official was like if you learn the windmill, because the windmill was a move that was advanced. And it was something that not anyone could just do, because it had so many different movements within one move. So you had to really break it down and practice it and go through failing and not getting it for a long period of time. But then once you finally got that move, you were official and you were able to do it, and everyone gave you props for it. When I first started breaking in 1982, my first crew that I got down with, it was a crew within our neighborhood. The crew was called Grandmaster Breakers, and the reason why we picked that name is because, again, we were inspired by Kung Fu flicks, and so the Grandmaster was always like, you know, the top skilled master of the art form. We got like sweatshirts and put the flock letters on the back of them, said Grandmaster Breakers on the back. And we grew up in Wallingford. It's a neighborhood that's just north of the city, and so we would get on our bus and it would take us across the Aurora Bridge, and we would be at Seattle Center in about 10 minutes. We would hang out there religiously every weekend, and that's where everyone would go. They'd go hang out at the Seattle Center to go break. We started repping and catching noise and getting a reputation, and there was an older crew called the Seattle Circuit Breakers. Supreme, his name back then was Danny D-Rock. He go by, and that was his like B-boy name. He goes by Supreme now. He's a record collector, great producer, and he's big in the scene in Seattle. He was the, I would say, leader of that group, and they actually came and handpicked some of the best guys from the Grandmaster Breakers and pulled them into Seattle Circuit. And I was one of the guys who didn't get picked to get into Seattle Circuit Breakers. I was one of the people that was left behind with Grandmaster. And so I continued Grandmaster Breakers. and we entered in a competition called Summer Break '84. It was a citywide breakdance competition sponsored by Como 4 News. Steve Poole, rest in peace, he was hosted it. He was our weatherman, but he was like a cool dude, just like tapped into the scene. And after that battle, I actually got down with Seattle Circuit Breakers a little bit after that. Rewind, there was something that happened before then. I was in the Grandmaster Breakers, and then right after Summer Break '84, I got down with a crew called D-Roxy Crew. During that time was like older heads. You know, you'd have the crew of older heads that were probably like seniors in high school, or like juniors and like 17, 18 years old, or maybe just graduated from high school. But for us, when we're like in middle school or ninth grade, they were like older, you know. So when we had opportunities to kind of get down with the older cats, that was kind of like you're official, you know, you get put down. And so I got down with D-Roxy Crew. I was like 13 at the time, and I would take the bus like after school, or just hang out in the South End after school till like late at night. We didn't have cell phones or pagers or anything back then, so it was just like a pay phone, or you'd call from a house phone and let your parents know where you're at. But if you weren't very responsible like myself, you would just hang out, you know, and then just get home when you get home, and then you get in trouble by your parents. There was a SeaTac Holiday Inn that we used to do shows at. It was shady. You know, we were doing shows like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. They're like, D-Roxy Crew, and we'd go out, and there'd be a bunch of like drunk people at the bar watching us. And I did that a couple times, and my mom was like, nah, you can't be like hanging out doing shows at SeaTac Airport and taking the bus home. So that didn't last long, and then I got down with Seattle Circuit Breakers. Seattle Circuit Breakers was a crew that was really established at the time. We were sponsored by Adidas and Swatch, did a bunch of shows, and so that was more of like a professional type crew. You know, when we were coming up, it was more about just repping and battling and getting your name out. And then by the time, you know, like 84, 85, we were like doing shows, getting sponsored, getting paid. We were getting shows, say like sponsored by Chevrolet to do the auto show at the Kingdom, and they would hire us, and they would pay us like $100 a day for 7 days. And being like 13, 14 years old, and you making like $700 in a week, you're like, you know, I'm like, forget school, you know what I mean? I'm like making money. That's kind of like what got me into kind of building the b-boyism into like a career, and being able to say to myself, you know, this is something that I've loved and grew up doing, but if there's a way of being able to make a lifestyle out of it or make a living out of it, then I'm all in. But I would talk to my parents, and they're like, so what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, I'm gonna break and dance for a living. They'd be like, how are you gonna make money doing that? And I was like, well, you can do it, you know. And I was tapped in with a lot of the New York City Breakers and Rocksteady Crew, original b-boys from New York, and kept in touch with them. And they started a show called Jam on the Groove. Jam on the Groove is actually a theater show. It's the first hip-hop theater, full production hip-hop theater show. It came from b-boys, poppers, graffiti writers from the original generation of b-boys and hip-hop practitioners. And when they came out to Seattle, I had the opportunity to kind of get up with Fable and Ken Swift, and they knew me from the scene already, and they were like, yo, you should try out for Jam on the Groove. And I was planning on moving to New York prior to that already. So I told them, I said, I definitely want to try out, but I want to try out in New York. And I knew if I got hired there, I'd end up doing the world tour as opposed to like maybe just the West Coast tour. So I went out to New York, and I tried out, and I became like the last member of Get Original and Jam on the Groove. The time that breaking started dying out, the gangsterism and kind of a lot of people, especially on the West Coast, moved from the positive hip-hop lifestyle to more of like, say, a negative gangsterism type lifestyle where you're selling drugs and crack, and you know, you're gang banging and drive-by shootings and all the other crazy stuff that goes along with that lifestyle. You know, with kids that are growing up and you're looking for different outlets, a lot of times it's going to be whatever's cool at the time, or even if you're in a situation, it might be what is going to get you to the next phase, what's going to get you paid, or what's going to, get you out of a certain situation. Whether you got caught up doing drugs or you got caught up selling drugs, it's like one or the other. It pretty much took over the community. A lot of the very influential and popular people in the scene got caught up in that lifestyle, and they ended up going to jail, getting killed or murdered. These guys were seeing that happen, and they decided to make a off-Broadway show called So What Happens Now, because a couple of the key members, Buck 4 and Kuriaki, they ended up getting caught up in that lifestyle and passing, and so they were kind of like, well, let's make a show kind of in their respect, in their name. And then people started realizing like, hey, this can be something a lot bigger. And so they got sponsored by Calvin Klein and some other production company that was able to put them on tour. So my crew that I'm down with right now is DVS crew. That's my original crew from here in Seattle, aside from the old breaking crews in the 80s. The original members, Ray 1, Soul 1, Sneak 1, Hughes, and I, we started the crew mainly through graffiti and breaking. But the way the crew really started was Soul and I. Soul 1, rest in peace. He was like one of my best friends growing up, and him and I went to middle school together. So we went to Summit. It's in the Central District. That's where we went to middle school, and that's where we both learned about hip-hop at the same time. He lived in the South End, I lived in the North End, but when we came to school, our common bond was like hip-hop, and we became partners, just like breaking partners, because we would see each other every day at school. And then right after high school, Soul and I, we would always like be partners, doing graph together and breaking together. We would go to parties, and this is like when breaking was played out, no one else was doing it anymore. We'd go to like a house party, and they'd be playing music, and then we would like clear out a circle, and me and Soul would start breaking, and everyone's like, yo, these guys are breaking, you still do that? And we're like, hell yeah, and we would just keep breaking and hanging out. And then later on we saw that like Rocksteady was like bringing it back, in the early 90s. So when we saw that, we just knew that we were on the right path. We didn't want to give up on it because it was just something we had a lot of love for. Our skill level kept, getting better and better. DVS crew really started from me and Soul, just continuing hip hop. And then we started thinking about a new crew name, and I thought of DVS. And DVS stood for Dropping Vicious Styles, or originally it was The Vandals Succeed. It was The Vandals Succeed, because we were just bombing stuff and doing graph. And then we changed it to Dropping Vicious Styles, and really that's where DVS came from. And then we met Ray 1. He was painting in a garage. There's a old club called Rock Candy, and there's a parking garage right across the street, and it was abandoned, and that's where all the graph writers would go and get up and do pieces. And me and Soul rolled in there one day, and we saw this dude, this like tall white dude, like doing a piece, and his letters were like fresh, super clean. And we're like, and it looked like European style. Like we were up on like different styles and like what people were doing in LA and what people were doing in Europe. And when we seen him, we were like, yo, he's like busting that like fat outline European style. And so we stepped to him, we were like, yo, what's up? And he introduced himself as Ray 1. He's from Switzerland. And we're like, yeah, that's dope. We should get up sometime. Let's go write. And him and Soul, I think, went and did a piece. And at the time, he was going to Seattle Art Institute, and Sneak was going there at the time. So he came back to school, and him and Sneak were doing graffiti together. Sneak, he grew up in West Seattle. Basically, he knew Rubik from back in the day, and Rubik was like big in his neighborhood for tagging and getting up and stuff. So him and Ray, like Sneak and Ray, were going to art school together, and Ray was like, yo, I met this dude Soul and Fever. They're down with this crew DVS, and they're pretty dope, and you should come paint with us. I heard that they hang out at the Rock Candy and be breaking and shit. So he told Sneak that, and Sneak's still breaking. So Sneak was like, yo, I'm going to go to Rock Candy, and I'm going to bring my pen. I'm going to fucking meet these guys. Like, we didn't know. We just, like, would go there every weekend, and we would break and fuck around. one day, like, this dude with like dreads came, Chuck Taylors, and we're breaking, came in the circle and just started busting footwork and windmills. I'm like, oh shit. So we stepped to him, we're like, yo, he's like, yeah, what's up, my name's Sneak. And then after that we just started hanging, and then that's when we pulled like Sneak and Ray in the crew, and then Hughes got down. So that was like the original DVS crew, and like how we started that. As far as like DVS goes, a lot of our influence comes from New York, comes from kind of like the blueprint. You know, you learn your foundation. You know, whether you're kicking letters, you learn how to do straight letters, and you get really strong foundation. And then from there, you know, after you learn how to kick your strong letters, then you learn the extensions and, you know, the arrows, and, you know, you start getting your wild style after you build the foundation. And we've always stuck to that principle. A lot of our influences come from TC5, IBM, you know, a lot of like Devious Does, and the way that like he would just stack his letters. You know, if you look at the Uprock album cover, it's like a famous record cover done by Devious Does, and it says Uprock and has all the characters of Rocksteady on there. But if you look at those letters, they're done, you know, really well, like traditional graph style letters, but they're almost like block letters. Like anyone can read these letters. They're super legible, but they have just enough funk where you can tell that it's just got a flow to it, you know, and it's almost, it dances. And that's what they mean by, you know, being able to take your basics and your foundation and put a twist on it and really get it to move. And whether it's graffiti or breaking or MCing or DJing, it all kind of has that same blueprint. You learn the foundation, and then you can bring your own style into it. Really, I'm speaking more on the behalf of like Soul and Sneak and Hughes, who are like really getting up and doing full like burner productions on walls. There was a bar or a tavern called the Comet. It's up on Broadway. There was some people doing some pieces on it, but DVS was the first crew that actually painted over the whole wall top to bottom, you know, and did a whole production. And then ever since, it was like every piece that would go on that wall would be a production. That's what I think DVS was kind of getting known as far as like the production level goes. It's like when writers were doing trains back in the day, you know, you probably started off with a throw up or something, then you do like a window down, you know, and then it's like you do a top to bottom. It's like from the very top to the bottom. Then someone said, you know, we're going to do a whole car, and there's like no metal left on that car showing. It's just from end to end paint. It's almost like if you're a tattoo artist, right? Tattoos will go on your skin forever. But if you have blowouts in your lines, and if the line doesn't connect or it goes past, you know, it's not really good work. Hip hop in general, you're always being ridiculed and you're being chastised even. It's one of those things where you try to get bulletproof. I want to be able to say I can do a little bit of everything. I don't need to do everything the best, you know, but if I could do a little bit of everything and have strong foundation, then you're going to have a better package. So back in the early or mid 90s, Soul One, he had a scholarship to go back to New York, Parsons School of Art, and he spent a whole summer out there, maybe a little longer than a summer, but he went to the Rocksteady anniversary. He met tons of old school writers. And that was kind of something that him and I would always talk about, is going back to the Mecca, meeting some of the early practitioners and presenting what we do in our style, and see even if we would get acceptance, because we were all the way over in the West Coast, Pacific Northwest, all the way opposite corner, and people in New York had no idea what we were doing over here. You don't really know until you go to someone else's backyard, right? So that was kind of the ultimate test. And so ever since then, like after 95, I started like putting that energy, like I'm going to move to New York and kind of see if I can take my career to the next level, because there's a lot of opportunities out there, whether it was doing music videos, traveling, doing tours, doing Broadway, off Broadway. And I went to go visit before I went to go out, and when I went to go visit, I went to go see Icy Ice from the New York City Breakers. He was a good friend of mine. He lived out here in the late 80s. He was doing a show with the New York City Breakers in Seattle, and wanted to finish high school. So he stayed in Seattle and finished his senior year at Ballard High School. And during that time, him and I were like training partners. This was in 1987, 86, 87. We kept in touch, we're friends, and he lived back in New York, so I went to go visit him, and he had a connection with all the old school b-boys. So I went to stay with him, and I met a bunch of people and kind of hit it off. And I met some guys from the New York City Breakers, Powerful Pexter, and there was a guy, London, who was a friend of the crew, who was really helping out a lot, revive the name of the New York City Breakers. I visited Icy Ice and Pex, and I met London. And so like maybe a few months later, London hit me up and he said, yo man, I heard you were planning on moving out to New York. I got a place in the Bronx. It's an apartment, and we're planning on doing these shows and doing a bunch of stuff, and I'd love for you to come out. We'll do shows. We'll figure out how to pay rent and everything. Zulu Gremlin is coming out. He'll be your roommate. And I knew of Zulu Gremlin, but I never met him before. But I knew he was like a dope b-boy from LA. He was already doing Jam on the Groove. So I actually moved out there. It was 97 is when I moved out. It was July 1997. Zulu Gremlin came like 2 or 3 weeks later, and we started building on shows. We created a group called the Breakbeat Assassins. It was Zulu Gremlin, myself, B-Boy Speedy, and B-Boy London, and we were doing shows in the Bronx and just kind of like making noise. They were working on revamping the New York City Breakers, but at the time, Alien Ness was also in the scene, and he was living in New York, and Alien Ness was also a member of the New York City Breakers when they came to Seattle. Icy Ice stayed in Seattle, and while he stayed in Seattle on that tour, Alien Ness, who was down with his New York City Breakers, he stayed in Tacoma. So he didn't go back to New York. He stayed in Tacoma, so 2 of the New York City Breakers stayed out here, you know, in the Pacific Northwest on that tour. For some reason, they fell in love with it so much, they're just like, yo, I'm staying. So Alien Ness was a member of the New York City Breakers that I met back in the early 80s. So when I moved back to New York, I kept in touch with him. I said, yo, what's going on? These guys are doing the New York City Breakers thing. What's up? You know, and he's like, yeah, I heard about that. And then he got put on. So he started doing work with those guys because he was like an original New York City Breaker. So when I moved out to New York, Fable said, I got a bunch of opportunities. I'm going to put a crew together. So it was a crew that consists of Popmaster Fable, Sweepy, Alien Ness, myself, and Frosty Freeze. And we were doing shows like in Germany and Italy. So like Fable would get calls and be like, hey, I have this group, we can do a show, and he'd book these shows for us. And that's how I started working with Alien Ness and Fable and Sweepy and Frosty Freeze. And so a lot of those guys, aside from Alien Ness and myself, were all Rocksteady heads. Rocksteady, you know, was still, you know, Mr. Wiggles and Frosty Freeze out there. So they started getting into the ear of the like elders of that crew and saying like, hey, we should put down Ness and Fever, because they're like got crazy routines, they're blowing it up right now. It'd be like a dope fit for Rocksteady. You had to battle to get in Rocksteady, and they were talking about it like previously, we're gonna have to blow through all these crews, and then after this be prepared to battle, because like I know that that's how they're gonna flip it on us. You know, we went through like about 5 crews and we battled to get in, and so that's kind of like how we got down with Rocksteady crew. So they knew that me and Ness, we had that chemistry, and so we became the Secret Weapon Part 2, and then we became a pretty like vital part, I would say, to Rocksteady, of just like getting back in the battle scene and just, you know, putting the name, stamping it, you know. And because, you know, there was a time where Rocksteady was kind of like chapters, you know. It's like you go, there's like a bunch of people from LA that's down with Rocksteady, and there's people from New York. But then when we came to New York, we became known more of like a battle crew at the time. I grew up, you know, watching Rocksteady, watching Flashdance, and loving Frosty Freeze's style. You know, just like the way he would do like these Charlie Rocks and, you know, be up on his toes, and, you know, his sporadic footwork style was like straight, you know, from the 70s, you know, just that original style, and it had that funk. And I remember the first time ever talking to Frosty, he was in the hospital, and I was on the phone with him because Zulu Gremlin had his number. He said, yo, I'm talking to Frosty Freeze. You want to holler at him? And I was like, hell yeah. You know, I was all hype and shit. Like, yo, Frosty Freeze. And he's like talking to me. And like, I'm like thinking like, oh, this guy is probably like, he's like sick, whatever. And like, this dude was just talking just like forever. And I don't know how he did it, but he just remembered everything from like the color of sneakers they were wearing back in the day. Like, his memory was like impeccable. Frosty was like definitely a super, super cool brother, and he would like invite anyone and everyone into his home, and you know what I mean? Like, you go meet like Mama Frost and like you're just chilling at the crib. And yeah, man, rest in peace to Frosty, man. I love that brother, and he was good people. Growing up and watching breaking on TV, you know, it's kind of like, man, it'd be cool to be on TV, or it'd be cool to be able to like do what you love for a living. It's not until actually you're doing it is when you understand like the riches you get out of it. You know, like being a b-boy, especially in the 90s, you know, it's the money was just like secondary. You know, you're doing it just because you love it, but you know, people weren't really even taking you that seriously. And when you would try to negotiate, they were always like lowballing you because they just figure you're like some kid off the street. But we always found a way, going all over the world, visiting different countries that I would have never imagined going to. I would never imagine myself being able to have those opportunities and go to those countries, but breaking took me there. During those times when you're, you know, eating pizza slices for food and struggling to pay rent, and you know, you're doing all these really cool things. Really, the greatest payoff is being able to do these things that you would never be able to do before, experience cultures that you would never be able to do. And so that's where breaking brought me. Some of the biggest shows that I did that were like really cool: Carnegie Hall, I did a show with Wyclef. He did this show that consists of crazy talent. I mean, there was Stevie Wonder, Eric Clapton, Whitney Houston. We performed with Destiny's Child. The first person like we came into the room and met was Stevie Wonder. Like, holy shit, I just shook Stevie Wonder's hand. You turn around and Whitney Houston is like in this elevator that opens up, and she's chilling in there with like her bodyguards, and then it closes. There's also things like Dave Chappelle. I did the Dave Chappelle show. Dave Chappelle was like my favorite comedian at the time. He was blowing up, had his show going, and we did this scene called The Black President, and it's where he was playing the Black President, and we were one of his constituents from the Bronx. It was like the Rock Steady crew, and we were like on the side, like up rocking and shit. And it was like hella funny. Like Dave Chappelle was like cracking up, like running out of the studio and shit. And it's funny because a lot of times when you do videos, music videos or TV shows, a lot of times it ends up on the editing floor. You might get chopped out. You might be in there for a quick blink second. You know, you see me do a head spin, and then that's the next scene. And then when it came out, like the season, I never saw it like come out on TV. I like watched a bunch of the episodes, like damn. And then I bought the DVD because like season 2, we're like, oh, you know, I watched the DVD, and it was like in none of the seasons, like, oh, we must have got chopped, you know. And then there was like these special like extra scenes at the end of the DVD, and we ended up making it on the extra scenes that were cut, and so it's like out there still. Bunch of music videos, Gangstar, Tony Touch. Sweepy was doing the Intergalactic Beastie Boy video. He was the robot in that. I got into mentorship mostly. It was through really wanting to have opportunities to just do hip-hop and expose the next generation to hip-hop. Kamikaze is a local DJ that I would hang out with all the time, and we would work together, and we were into hip-hop. He was DJing, I was breaking. We were talking about setting up this course. We call it like triple thread or something like that, and basically it was like art, music, and dance. Music has beatboxing, rapping, production, DJing, you know, all that fits into music. Dancing, you know, there was rocking, popping, locking, you know, breaking, you know, you have graph, you know, you even have like clothing that people get into, like fashion and that type of thing. We're like, okay, let's set up this program where we teach kids about hip hop and we'll go into schools, like after school program type thing. So we went to this middle school called Mercer Middle School on Beacon Hill and told them what we wanted to do. They said, yeah, come through. So we brought our like VHS tape with like all the old school breaking footage on it and some scratching, and we went up to the after school program, showed the kids videos. I got down kamikaze, scratch, and the kids, like, they loved it, because like back then there was really nothing like that. And a lot of the kids at the time, I would say it was like 93 or so, around that era, a lot of their older brothers started gangbanging and stuff. And so their influences were just looking at their older brothers who were gangbanging. So a lot of these kids, that's the direction they were going in. They were hanging out, watching their older siblings and being like, I want to be like that, and then end up doing dumb shit or getting caught up, shootouts and all kinds of crazy stuff. So we ended up offering the after school program. We did it for like maybe a month at Mercer. And then right after that, some of the kids were like, hey, there's this community center right up the street called Jefferson. It's got a huge like dance floor studio with mirrors and wood floors. We should just go over there and see if we can use it. So it was like, first started like Mondays, and like every Monday we'd start like at 4 after school and then go to like 7 or something, like a few hours. And then it became Mondays and Fridays or something, it was just like a couple days a week. And then after a while it was just building and building, and it just became like every Friday. It just became the thing. Everybody who wanted to go break, everyone who wanted to come from out of town, they would go to Jefferson. So that was like the hub. So that's kind of like basically how that started. We would teach at Jefferson, and we weren't getting paid. We were just going out there out of our own time and just being like, putting kids on the game. The way I would teach the kids in Seattle and at Jefferson was straight foundation, straight basics. You're going to learn the New York style where the dance was created. And a lot of kids would have these influences from like LA, and so they would come to practice with like their socks. They would like dance with no sneakers on and their socks, and they were like helmets on their head. I'd be like, yo, that's whack. I'd be like, yo, back in the day, if you came to the gym and you were breaking in your socks, we'd just steal your shoes and you'd walk home in your socks. And the helmet's corny too. Back then, there were like particular rules. That was a big misconception. It was like, oh, breaking's cool. You could do whatever you want. And grab a partner and do-si-do, right? Is that breaking? Not at all, right? So you can't just do whatever you want. You have to stay within the confines of the rules. And so really that's what our thing was. It's like, you're going to come here and you're going to learn the DVS way. Our students, they really like stayed dedicated. They became successful, and through that blueprint, they became the Boom Squad, the Massive Monkeys. When I would come back from New York and these guys were already established, I'd come visit Seattle and they'd be like, yo, I got a gig for you. How dope is that? That's where the connection started making sense. I've been doing it for a long time, since the early 80s. I would consider myself like the third generation. I wouldn't have known about breaking unless it was on TV and the media didn't get a hold of it and kind of show everyone like what was happening in New York at the time. But really the exploitation of the culture was the main reason why I was able to even know about it or even do it. I've seen all the different, underground heads, and then the heads that are sponsored and the heads that are in the Olympics and the heads that are wanting to write the rules for the Olympics, the people who are judging for the Olympics, the people who are battling or coaching for the Olympics. There's all these different opportunities that you can have when it comes to things like b-boying being in the Olympics. But then you'll have other people that are the hardcores and be like, yo, that's corny, that's not what the culture's about, they're watering it down, which there's some truth to that, depending on like how you're looking at it. Maybe it's the music is not the same, maybe it's just the way it's presented is not the same, but it's opportunity. And if you're so closed-minded where you're not going to allow any opportunity, then there's going to be no growth. And you could say the same thing about any subculture. It's like skateboarding. Corporate sponsorship and the X Games and ESPN and all that is corny. We're not going to do it. Then there's not going to be any of these skaters who are making a decent living or like actually making more than a decent living, where they're, you know, making really good money and buying really nice homes and cars and providing for their family. For you to say, yo, I'm going to keep it mad real because I would rather do that than provide for my family and make a good living and be able to do what I love for a living and be comfortable, that doesn't make sense to me. It's all a part of the culture. It's all part of breaking, whether you agree with it or not.
Here's a little story.
But